Greetings! It's wonderful that you can join us here again for another Bible study. This time we're going to cover the chapters and verses in the Bible. Many of you might think this is an odd topic for a Bible study, but it's really quite fascinating. See, the chapters and the verses that we see in Bibles originally were not there. John 3:16 was just another sentence in John. There was no way that we could pinpoint which section or what part of the John that came from. And that makes a lot of sense if you think about it. When you write something, you don't put chapters and verses with each few sentences that you write. You just write. And that's what these early writers of the Christian and Jewish faith did. Now, pretty early on, people started subdividing the Bible into different manageable sections. But it's not the same as what we have today. Early copies of the Old Testament divided the sections into systems of paragraphs, and they would label them using 2 letters of the Hebrew alphabet. This gave a little bit of order to the Old Testament, but it's nothing like what we have today in the Old Testament. Now, later they divided the Old Testament, specifically the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, into 154 different sections. They did this so you could read 1 section a week and finish the Torah in 3 years. Now, in Babylon, they did it a little bit different. They divided the Torah into 53 or 54 sections so it could be read completely in 1 year. But these sections were quite large and quite unmanageable. It would be difficult to pick out a specific point of the Bible from these sections. It was more just a way that you could read through the Bible in a year's time or 3 years' time. Now, the New Testament has a much later history because it was written much later than the Old Testament, as its name kind of suggests. By the 4th century AD, there was a few ways to divide the New Testament, but neither was too well thought out or wasn't quite the same as we'd have today. The first major way was to divide it by topics. And another way was dividing the Gospels into parts that were listed on a table. This was a way that they could kind of organize what section it was, but it really was really hard to use and it was quite unmanageable. Now, both of these made it a little easier to work with the New Testament, but neither quite did the same as our modern chapters and verses do. Now, in the 9th century, there was a Tours manuscript of the Bible that had divisions of chapters. So it didn't have verses, but there was different chapter titles so that someone could go through and say, oh, that's chapter 12 or chapter 1. So it would have some way that someone could look at the Bible and see something and show it to someone else without having to say, yeah, it's just somewhere in the Gospel of John. Now, the modern version of chapters that we have today was created by Archbishop Stephen Lanton and Cardinal Hugo de Centro-Carrol in the 13th century. Now, you got to think about this. This is the 13th century. That is more than 1,000 years after the writing of the Bible was finished. So for 1,000 years, the Bible had no chapters in it as we know them today. That means that we are closer to the creation of chapters in the Bible than the creation of chapters was to the writing of the Bible itself. And now, we go around and it's almost impossible to find a Bible without chapters and verses in it. Now, verses are even newer than chapters. The Bible was first divided into verses in the early 1500s, but not many people used it back then. In fact, it wasn't until a shorter version of verses was adopted in 1551 that that system of verses became widely accepted. So this was many, many years after the Bible had already had chapters. That means that our version of chapters and verses together in the Bible has only been around for about 500 years. Now, there's some people who are beginning to argue that our Bibles need to get rid of chapters and verses because they said that these late additions hurt the way that we read the Bible. It's impossible now for us as modern readers with chapters and verses to read the Bible as it was originally intended, because we unintentionally either group things together or separate things that may not have meant to be grouped together or separated. They have now published several copies of the Bible without any chapters or verses, just with text. Now, that might be a little bit harder to read, but maybe it's something that we should think about. So, I hope you've learned a little something and learned that chapters and verses in the Bible isn't quite an uninteresting topic.